This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today I'm continuing with Core Set 2021 Limited Review Week. This includes videos of me talking about all the cards in the set individually, an archetype guide, and a top 10 on the biggest bombs in the format. So far, I've covered every white, blue, and black card in the set, and today I'm continuing with red. A few disclaimers before we proceed. These ratings are of course based on my opinion before actually playing with the cards, so I'm going to get some things wrong. Also, just to restate it, because it always comes up, this video is only about limited. That means draft and sealed. I'm not commenting here on constructed formats. Finally, I use a letter grade system to sum up how I feel about particular cards, and if you aren't familiar with what those letter grades mean, you can find an explanation of the grades in the comments. Alright, let's get started with our first red card. First up, it's Battle Rattle Shaman, who for 3 generic and a red is a 2/2 uncommon goblin shaman. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may have target creature get +2/+0 until end of turn. This is a nice reprint. This type of effect is easy to underrate, I think, but don't make that mistake. +2/+0 to a creature every combat makes creatures able to attack that simply could not have attacked before. This is especially spicy with creature tokens, who are pretty expendable, and turning them into 3/1s makes them into more of a problem for your opponent. Note, by the way, in a pinch, the shaman can also target himself, making the fail case of the card less miserable than it would have been otherwise. I'm not saying I think you should take this super early. After all, the creature has a pretty weak body for 4 mana, even if it can be a 4/2 on your turn, but it's a serviceable card for red decks that will really help them find ways to send in attackers and do damage in ways they couldn't before. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Bolt Hound, who for 2 generic and a red is a 2/2 elemental dog at uncommon. He's got haste, and when he attacks, other creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. A 3 mana 2/2 with haste usually isn't anything special. Probably a D+ or a C-, but this is a whole lot more than that. The Warcry effect here will be adding additional damage to the board and will often enable creatures to attack who just could not before. The Hound is obviously going to really shine in aggro decks, especially those that can go wide, and if you can keep it alive after that first attack, it will do it again on the next turn. There will definitely be some games that start with 2-drop, Bolt Hound, and attack for 5, and then you do it again on the next turn. This set seems to have the makings of a very legitimate aggro deck, and I think for that reason, you can reasonably go after Bolt Hound with an early pick, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Bone Pit Brute, who for 4 generic and 2 red is a 4/5 Cyclops at common. He's got menace, and when he enters the battlefield, target creature gets +4/+0 until end of turn. This card will pack a surprising punch. A 6 mana 4/5 with menace isn't the greatest rate. It's like 1 more mana than you'd normally want to pay, but I think the Brute's enter the battlefield trigger will give you back that value for sure, especially because it adds that damage to the table the turn it comes down. Now, it won't matter in all board states, but +4/+0 is a huge enough boost that most of the time, this is going to enable one attack you couldn't have done before, or make an attack more painful for your opponent. Kind of like with Battle Rattle Shaman, one of the nastier things you can do is put this on a 1/1 token to make it into a 5/1. That suddenly is no joke. Now, I'm not telling you that the Brute is an amazing card by any means, but I think as a top curve in some red decks, this evasive creature who has an immediate impact on the board will do an okay job. I'm giving him a C. Next up, it's Brash Taunter, who for 4 generic and a red is a 1/1 rare goblin. He's indestructible. When he's dealt damage, he deals that much damage to target opponent, and you can pay 2 generic and tap him to have him fight another creature. This is kind of like a red Stuffy Doll, but I think it's a lot better than Stuffy Doll. That said, 5 mana for a 1/1 indestructible would probably be an F. A creature that can just block forever and can't even kill most things in combat just isn't worth it. But the rest of the text here is nice because it means that blocking forever is bad news for your opponent, since the Taunter will do some considerable damage to your opponent when it blocks their creatures. This is further augmented by the fact that you can fight with the Taunter, so even if your opponent stops attacking with their biggest creature out of fear, the Taunter will still pick a fight with it, and that is going to give you a source of serious damage. You can even block something and fight it all in the same turn, which means you can actually take down X2s, which might matter sometimes. Yeah, this is a cool design, and I think the result is actually a pretty good card, and one that you will first pick pretty often. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Burn Bright, which for 2 generic and a red is a common instant, and creatures you control get +2/+0 until end of turn. Even in a format with a good go-wide strategy, I'm not a huge fan of Burn Bright. Yes, it can represent a ton of damage, but it also doesn't add to the board at all, and is utterly useless up until the point where it helps you do lethal. Now, my initial impression of the format, as I've said, is there will be a legit aggro deck, probably a red-white one, and Burn Bright will find a home there, but it should not be played anywhere else. And even in that deck, going for more than one of these can hurt, since you really want to be playing creatures and turning them sideways, and getting multiple Burn Brights isn't what you want all the time. I guess I'll give this a build-around grade, say it's an F in most red decks, but a C in a deck that really got there on aggro. It will undoubtedly enable some quick kills, but don't overlook the downsides of this card, namely that it's highly situational. Next, it's Chandra, Heart of Fire, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a legendary Planeswalker Chandra at Mythic Rare. She starts with 5 loyalty. Her +1 ability, her first +1 ability, says discard your hand, then exile the top 3 cards of your library. Until end of turn, you may play cards exiled this way. Her +1 says Chandra, Heart of Fire, deals 2 damage to any target. And her -9 says search your graveyard and library for any number of red, instant, and or sorcery cards and exile them. Then shuffle your library. You may cast them this turn. Add 6 red mana. This Chandra seems real powerful. Her first +1 can give you some serious card advantage in the later stage of the games, effectively allowing you to draw 3 cards a turn once you end up in a situation where you don't have cards in your hand. And remember, she's raising her loyalty when she does this for you. Sure, you won't be able to play them all every turn, but the ability will still result in being an additional card on turns in the late game at worst. Her +1 kills small creatures, or can even threaten your opponent by damaging them. A Planeswalker who can draw cards and be repeatable removal tends to be good, and that is what we have here. Her ultimate is also no joke, since she will often be letting you cast enough spells that you can end the game on the spot. Theoretically, when you use it, you'll at least have the 5 mana you use to play her, plus the 6 from the ability, so you get to search up at least 11 mana worth of spells and just fire them all off on the same turn. I think the card advantage and the removal do enough here to get Chandra into the bomb range. Next up, it's Chandra's Incinerator, which for 5 generic and a red is a 6/6 elemental at rare. It costs X less to cast, where X is the total amount of non-combat damage dealt to your opponents this turn. It has Trample, and whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, Chandra's Incinerator deals that much damage to target creature or planeswalker that player controls. So the worst case here is a red Colossal Dreadmaw, and that's going to be worth a C or so. But this does more than that, since it can reduce its cost and allow you to turn burn you point at your opponent into removal spells. Now, setting this all up won't be incredibly easy or anything, but most red decks will have sources of non-combat damage, and just having a few of those will make this a really good card for you. If you can do 3 to your opponent and kill their X3, you're going to be getting some serious value no matter what, and if you can do it multiple times, it's going to be silly. It takes some setting up, but nothing insane, and it has a great floor, and for that reason, I think this is worth taking early. I'm giving the Incinerator a B. Next up, it's Chandra's Magmut, who for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 elemental dog at common, and you can tap it to deal 1 damage to a player or planeswalker. 2 mana 2/2s are borderline playables and limited these days, if that's all the card does, but this has an additional ability that makes a pretty big difference. The ability to do 1 to the opponent every turn means that the Magmut stays relevant all game long after being a decent play on turn 2. This will end up threatening a lot of extra damage on the opponent, and by the way, this counts as non-combat damage for cards like the Incinerator we just looked at. This is a high-quality common, though not quite one I want to take with the first pick. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Chandra's Pyreling, which for 1 generic and a red is a 1/3 elemental wizard at uncommon, and whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, it gets +1/+0 and gains double strike until end of turn. So, 2 mana 1/3s are borderline playables, and this does come with some upside. Non-combat damage turning this into a 2/3 double striker is no joke, and just the threat of that happening will often mean your opponent is unable to block it effectively, so they have to risk getting hit for 4 or let 1 damage through. As we've already seen, there are ways to do non-combat damage, like the Magmut and various burn spells, so it isn't a pipe dream to make that happen. That said, you will be hard-pressed to end up with a legit burn deck in Limited that can trigger this regularly. Instead, it's somewhere in the middle. For now, I am a bit skeptical of how often you'll be able to make the trigger happen, and as a result, I want to start this at a C. Next up, it's Conspicuous Snoop, who for 2 red mana is a 2/2 Goblin Rogue at rare. You play with the top card of your library revealed. You may cast Goblin spells from the top of your library, and as long as the top card of your library is a Goblin card, Conspicuous Snoop has all activated abilities of that card. This card's neat and even quite powerful, but that's probably only true in constructed formats. This set just doesn't have enough goblins for playing this to make sense. Sure, his baseline is as a 2 mana 2/2 that gives you information about the top card of your library, but remember, you're also giving information to your opponent, so that upside is kind of a wash and it might actually benefit your opponent more than you. It has a challenging casting cost for turn 2 as well, and that makes it a bit worse, because it isn't even a regular, easy-to-cast Grizzly Bear. Having 2 red on turn 2 is not a guarantee. I think all of that means you only play this in this format in the worst of situations. I'm giving this a D-. Next up, it's Crash Through, which for 1 red mana is a common sorcery. Creatures you control gain trample until end of turn, and it draws you a card. This card is usually not all that great, but in a format with lots of spell triggers, including prowess, it becomes a little more interesting. Trample to the whole board won't always matter, but triggering a few of your spell payoffs and drawing a card while you do it isn't too bad, and the times where the trample does matter will feel awesome. This seems like it will be reasonable in other red decks too, like the red-green one that cares about 4 or more power, so I think this does enough to get to a C-. It's a card you'll cut a fair bit, but it will make your deck more often than it might initially seem. Next up, it's Destructive Tampering, which for 2 generic and a red is a common sorcery, and it says choose 1, destroy target artifact. Creatures without flying can't block this turn. Having modality in a card like this is nice. You won't always have an artifact to blow up, and you also won't always be able to take advantage of making non-flyers unable to block, but by putting both of these situational effects together, you end up with a card that is useful in a wider number of situations. Kind of like Burn Bright, this is probably something you'll only really want to be running in hyper-aggressive decks, which probably means red-white. In those decks, this will allow you to find lethal out of nowhere sometimes. I guess that means this is another card that needs a build-around grade, because for most red decks, this is probably a D, and an okay card to bring out of the sideboard, but it probably gets a C in a red aggro deck, and out of your sideboard as well. Next up, it's Double Vision, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a rare enchantment, and whenever you cast your first instant or sorcery spell each turn, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. This kind of card isn't going to be worth it in limited most of the time. It looks like a lot of fun because that text box is so sweet, but the fact that it's a 5 mana enchantment that doesn't do anything to impact the board immediately means it's something that can get you into a lot of trouble. If you untap, things can get pretty sweet, but they aren't even guaranteed to. You have to have at least 1 instant or sorcery to really start reaping the rewards. Your average limited deck will only have 3 to 5 of those, so having 1 in your hand is no guarantee. You have to really get there on instants and sorceries to ever want to be playing this, and while I think that's doable, it isn't going to be easy. For that reason, I think I would say most decks in this format should not be playing this, but if you get, say, 10 plus instants or sorceries, it becomes quite powerful. Keep in mind, you can't chain a bunch of instants and sorceries together and get copies of all of them in one turn. This only works on the first instant or sorcery on a given turn. I'm going to give it an F in your typical limited deck, and a B in a deck that can really abuse it. Next up, it's Fiery Emancipation, which for 3 generic and 3 red is a mythic rare enchantment, and it says if a source you control would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals triple that damage to that permanent or player instead. Triple damage is some pretty exciting text, and while this is kind of a clunky enchantment, it will normally have a huge and immediate impact on the board, provided you have creatures. It's going to make your board incredibly frightening the turn it comes down. Almost no matter what creatures you have, as long as you have a few, this will be a huge issue for your opponent. Now, it does have an ugly fail case where you have like 1 thing in play, but the decks that want to play this in limited will be fairly creature heavy. Even if you're behind, it suddenly makes your blockers a heck of a lot more lethal. I mean, just imagine all you have is 3 2/2s in play. Now they can swing for 18 damage or trade for just about anything, and that isn't a crazy scenario at all. This does have the potential for a fairly ugly fail case, but it can turn most board states into game over or close to it. I think that makes this a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Furious Rise, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon enchantment, and it says at the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card until you exile another card with Furious Rise. This is a reprint, and it was a nice 4 power payoff last time, and it will be here too. It effectively draws you an extra card every turn, and that's the kind of advantage that will win you the game after you trigger it a few times. It's just hard for your opponent to keep up with that. It is obviously a build-around. An aggressive red deck that doesn't have creatures with high power won't play this, and it is unlikely a blue-red spells type deck would want it either. This is mostly here for the red-green deck, which is all about 4 or more power. I think that means we need to give it a build-around grade. It's probably a D in most red decks, but a B- in a deck that can really draw extra cards with it consistently. Next up, it's Fuhrer of the Bitten, which for 1 red mana is an aura at common. It's got enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and attacks each combat if able. This is another hyper-aggressive card for red. Fuhrer of the Bitten provides an efficient boost for only a single mana, and also has the small upside of being able to force an opposing creature to attack. That upside is mostly going to be useful in corner cases, and players will generally be more interested in putting this on their own creature, but yeah. I don't think you'll always want this, even in those really aggressive decks, but it's alright. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Gadrak, the Crown Scourge, who for 2 generic and a red is a 5/4 legendary dragon. At rare, it's got flying, and it can't attack unless you control 4 or more artifacts. And it says at the beginning of your end step, create a treasure token for each non-token creature that died this turn. So the fail case here is a 3 mana 5/4 flyer with Defender, which is actually kind of a reasonable card in Limited. It can lock down lots of creatures for a reasonable investment. It has high enough power that most things that attack into it will die. It'd probably be something like a C- and maybe even a C, but this comes with more upside than that. Making a treasure token at your end step for every non-token creature that died during your turn is nice. It gives you a solid source of fixing and ramp, something red doesn't always have access to. In addition to that, if you have enough artifacts, which includes treasure tokens, Gadrak can start attacking, and that will be pretty sweet. Keep in mind you can play this after a particularly messy combat, and you may find yourself making a ton of treasure. Most of the time, it is probably reasonable to expect he makes you 1 treasure on a given turn, but that's still pretty nice. If you need a defensive creature, he can do that. If you're in the black-red sacrifice, he can both pay you off for sacrificing things and give you treasure to sacrifice, and he also gives you some incentive to play some extra artifacts. So there are some hoops to jump through, but the floor here is reasonable, and the hoops he asks you to jump through aren't crazy. He works pretty well even on his own. I think most red decks in this format will find a spot for Gadrak and want to first pick him, giving him a B. Next up, it's Goblin Arsonist, which for 1 red mana is a 1/1 Goblin Shaman at common, and when it dies, you may have it deal 1 damage to any target. So, we've seen this before. It's a 1 mana creature that can trade up for X2s and even threaten 2-for-1s when your opponent has 2 X1s in play. It can also just ping the opponent for 1 when that's going to be meaningful. It also has a little bit of extra value in the sacrifice deck since it will give you some sort of value in addition to whatever the sacrifice effect gives you. I think this is a C. You'll play them for sure, but it isn't going to be anything close to a game changer. Next up, it's Goblin Wizardry, which for 3 generic and a red is a common instant, and it says create 2 1/1 red Goblin Wizard creature tokens with prowess. This has some pretty hilarious art, and seems like a reasonable card to me. 4 mana for 2 1/1s isn't the most amazing deal, but prowess makes it more appealing. It will be an effective card in the red-white go wide deck, and in blue-red spells deck, since it plays into what both of those decks want to be doing, and it won't be terrible in the black-red sacrifice deck either, since it gives you 2 bodies to sacrifice. I think this will be a solid card for all those decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Havoc Gesture, which for 4 generic and a red is a 5/5 devil at uncommon, and whenever you sacrifice a permanent, it deals 1 damage to any target. So a 5 mana 5/5 is usually at least a C in Limited. That's just a great rate for the format. Letting you ping something every time you sacrifice a permanent is some serious upside. It does this without asking for any additional mana investment of any kind, so as we saw with Mayhem Devil in the past, that's a very powerful ability. You have to end up with some sacrifice action going on to take full advantage, but if you're in black-red especially, that won't be all that hard. On top of that, the floor here is just very reasonable, as it is an efficient creature. I think that makes me want to take this pretty early. It's one of red's better uncommons. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Heartfire Immolator, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 human wizard at uncommon. It's got prowess, so anytime you cast a non-creature spell, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. and you can pay 1 red and sacrifice it to do damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker. This is a strong uncommon. You could take prowess away from this and it would probably be close to a B-, and you could take the sacrifice effect away and it would probably be a C+. The two abilities together have synergy too, obviously, since prowess will raise his power. Basically, this is a 2-drop that's relevant all game long, can attack well and threaten to grow, and has an ability that can function as removal. This is one of the best uncommons in the set, and one of the best red uncommons, and you're going to first pick this almost every time. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Hellkite Punisher, which for 5 generic and 2 red is a 6/6 dragon and uncommon. It's got flying, and he gets +1/+0 until end of turn. This is a big old dragon, and it's going to be an alright finisher for some decks. Costing 7 and not doing something that allows it to leave value behind even if it dies is rough, and there are going to be some big swings in games where one player sticks this and can swing for 10 the next turn, but if the opponent has any removal or disruption, the player who played the Punisher is going to be in a world of hurt because of the tempo. I think this is just a C. A big finisher you'll run in some red decks, but won't really play in more aggressive decks, and really, you're kind of hoping you find a more resilient finisher than this one. Next, it's Hobble Fiend, which for 1 generic into red is a 2/1 devil at common. It's got trample, and you can pay 1 generic and sacrifice another creature to put a +1/+1 counter on Hobble Fiend. Hobble Fiend is a 2-drop who can grow throughout the game by gobbling up some of your other creatures, something that is especially attractive on a creature with trample. Starting at 2 mana, it gives you something fairly reasonable. Now, it will be dangerous to go super crazy and all in on the Fiend, but if you have ways to take advantage of sacrificing things or some nice extra creature tokens around, it'll be pretty good. And there's always the threat of activation. It does only cost 1 mana here, so your opponent will have to be wary of your ability to use the sacrifice effect, and sometimes they'll just have to let it through to do 2 damage. This is a solid 2-drop. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Igneous Kerr, which for 1 generic into red is a 1/2 elemental dog at common, and you can pay 1 generic into red, and it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. On its own, I don't like this card a whole lot. It can represent a ton of damage for sure, but it can also be blocked and killed by just about any creature. And just to kill a 2/2 that blocks it, your total investment will amount to 4 mana, and that's not so good tempo-wise. However, this is one of the creatures that the red-white signpost uncommon can search up, and that makes it a little better. That said, I think you only play this if you get that signpost uncommon, or if you're desperate for playables or 2-drops, or maybe have the Dog Lord. I'm giving it a D+, with the caveat that it moves into the C range if you end up with the signpost. Next, it's Kinetic Auger, which for 3 generic into red is a star 4 human shaman at uncommon. It has trample. Its power is equal to the number of instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard, and when it enters the battlefield, you can discard up to 2 cards and then draw that many cards. This seems pretty nice to me. Obviously, you have to be in a spells deck to best utilize her, and if you don't have a good number of instants and sorceries, she isn't going to be great. Her into the battlefield trigger that allows you to rummage up to 2 times is nice, but probably not enough in every deck. I'm going to have to give this a build-around grade because the floor is pretty bad here, probably a D+. However, if you're in the spell deck and you can start her as a 4-mana 2/4 that gives you some card selection, that's pretty good, and she's going to grow throughout the game. I think in a blue-red spells deck, or any deck that can get several instants and sorceries, she's probably a B. By the way, most of the time, it won't be right to discard instants and sorceries to her trigger, since actually playing those spells will usually be more worthwhile. Next up, it's Onake Ogre, who for 2 generic into red is a 4/2 Ogre Warrior. This is a vanilla creature we've seen before, and it's pretty alright. 3 mana for a 4/2 plays reasonably well, and this format even has a red-green deck interested in 4 or more power, making the Ogre a little better. Still, you'll be cutting this pretty often. I think it's a C-. Next up, it's Pitchburn Devils, who for 4 generic and a red are a 3/3 devil at common, and when it dies, it deals 3 damage to any target. I like creatures like these. It will be very hard for your opponent to find a way to deal with Pitchburn Devils without getting 2 for 1. Obviously, aura removal spells can do it, but that's about it. It also represents some inevitable damage your opponent has to contend with, since if they ever drop to 3, they're pretty much dead. They can be sacrificed too in the right situation. You aren't usually going to want more than 1 copy of this since it's so expensive, but I feel the first copy will be welcome in all but the most aggressive of red decks. I'm giving this a C+. Next, it's Sanctum of Shattered Heights, which for 2 generic and a red is a legendary enchantment shrine at uncommon. You can pay 1 generic and discard a land card or shrine card, and it deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker, where X is the number of shrines you control. As I've already said this week, I'm fairly certain that a shrine deck will be a real thing in this format, so for all of these, I've been giving them grades in a deck that has no other shrines, and a grade in a deck that really gets there on shrines. And by really gets there, I mean at least 3, and ideally 4 or 5. So how good is a 3-mana enchantment that lets you discard things to do 1 damage to creatures or planeswalkers? Not that great. If it could hit players, that would be something, but 1 damage just isn't a huge threat most of the time. Sure, you can pick off small creatures or mess with combat, but giving up real cards to do that does not sound good to me. Discarding lands is fine, sure, but you don't usually start doing that until the mid to late game. I think this shrine is a pretty big dud on its own, probably a D-. You don't really want to run it. Now, if your deck has multiple shrines, this gets better for a couple of reasons. First, if this is doing 2 damage at a time, that's going to be quite good. Second, it helps you get rid of excess shrines you draw. They are legendary, so having multiples of the same shrine is kind of a pain, and this helps with that. Honestly though, this shrine doesn't seem crucial for the deck, the way the green, blue, and black ones do, so I think even there, it's probably just a C. Next up, it's Scorching Dragonfire, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant, and it deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If that creature or planeswalker would die this turn, exile it instead. This is a nice removal spell every time we see it. 3 damage for 2 mana is great, especially with the upside of exiling whatever you kill, which, well, not a huge deal, will matter sometimes. Keep in mind, it even keeps death triggers from happening. This is premium removal for sure, and is also potentially red's best common, and it's definitely worth first picking. I'm giving it a B. Next, it's Shock, which for 1 red mana is a common instant, and it deals 2 damage to any target. Shock is a core set veteran, and it's a nicely efficient card. 1 mana to do 2 damage to anything at instant speed is a good deal, and it will frequently be trading up for 2 drops and more. It's also nice reach to have to finish your opponent off, too. This format seems to have enough small creatures, not to mention a well-supported blue-red spells deck, and I think that makes Shock a reasonable card to go after early, even with a first pick in some weaker packs, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Soulseer, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon instant, and it deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker. That permanent loses indestructible until end of turn. 3 mana to do 5 at instant speed is quite good, and certainly premium removal. That is not hard to trade up with, and it can really manufacture some blowouts, thanks to the fact that it's an instant too. The turn-off indestructible part of the card won't make a huge difference, but it will matter sometimes. I think this is excellent removal and potentially the best uncommon in the set. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Spellgorger Weird, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/2 common weird, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put a +1/+1 counter on the weird. Spellgorger Weird is a very nice spell payoff, especially for a common, but it is so all in on spells that it isn't particularly good in a deck without a decent number of them. Keep in mind that this counts non-creature spells and not just instants and sorceries, though. It might be reasonable in an aggressive red-white deck that is running some cheap auras and tricks, but blue-red is really where you're going to want this most of the time, as it will just keep growing as you continue to play the game. I think this requires a build-around grade because it's going to be so underwhelming in most red decks, probably like a D. You need 7 or more non-creature spells to really get there with the weird, and when you can do that, it's pretty excellent for a common, probably a B-. Next up, it's Subira, Tulzidi Caravaner, who for 2 generic and a red is a 2/3 legendary human shaman at rare. She has haste. You can pay 1 generic mana to make another creature with power 2 or less unblockable, and you can pay 1 generic and a red and tap her and discard your hand, and until end of turn, whenever a creature you control with power 2 or less deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. This is a pretty sweet card for those aggro decks. A 3 mana 2/3 with haste is usually in the lower range of playable, maybe a D+ or a C-, and she comes with 2 nice activated abilities. Making other power 2 or less creatures unblockable for only a single mana means that she can represent some serious inevitability, and her card draw effect is a great way to help an aggressive red deck reload. Red decks are notorious for running out of gas too early, but Subira makes it hard for that to happen. You do have to build around her to some extent. You need to be a pretty aggressive low-curve deck, but I don't think that's a huge ask in red, especially when the fail case is still a fine card. I'm giving her a B-. You'll be first picking her sometimes. Next up, it's Sure Strike, which is 1 generic and a red for a common instant, and it says target creature gets +3/+0 until end of turn and gains first strike until end of turn. This is always a serviceable trick when we see it. It enables most creatures to win combat with whatever they're up against, but they are risks I'm willing to deal with when they can enable such a wide range of creatures to win combat against most things. This is probably the ideal combat trick for red decks interested in playing them, giving it a C. Next up, it's Terror of the Peaks, who for 3 generic and 2 red is a 5/4 dragon at Mythic Rare. It's got flying. It says spells your opponent casts that target Terror of the Peaks cost an additional 3 life to cast, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Terror of the Peaks deals damage equal to that creature's power to any target. Well, this is a bomb, which probably doesn't surprise anybody. You can really tell because when you chop up the card, it's still really good. Take away any of the 3 abilities it has and it would still be incredibly good, but it has all of them, including a highly efficient evasive body, an effect that punishes opponents if they kill it, and the last ability, which really pushes it into insane territory, which lets you turn every creature you play into a removal or burn spell. I like that even if they kill it before you get to untap and go crazy, they are at least taking 3 damage too. This is an easy first pick and a contender for best card in the set. I think it's an A+. Next up, it's Thrill of Possibility, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant. As an additional cost to cast it, you discard a card, and then you draw 2 cards. This is an alright card that allows you to give up 2 cards, the one you discard in the Thrill itself, and you get 2 new cards in exchange. This is effectively rummaging and will probably be the most useful in blue-red spells decks, though any red deck is kind of interested in playing this if they need it because it keeps you from flooding out. Still, it's an easy cut, which I think means it's a D+. Next up, it's Traitorous Greed, which for 3 generic and a red is an uncommon sorcery, and it says gain control of target creature until end of turn, untap that creature, it gains haste until end of turn, add 2 mana of any 1 color. I think this is one of the better threatened effects we've seen, at least for limited. The best thing to do with a temporary steal effect like this is to sacrifice the creature you steal for value. Frequently, these types of effects are held back by the fact that you have to have extra mana for many sacrifice effects, so paying 4 is usually a big deal because you can't actually always have mana available to sacrifice a creature, but this gives you mana back, which makes it a little easier. I would caution you, though, against thinking of this as fixing, even though it is mana of any color, and that's because you generally won't have enough mana left over after doing this for it to count towards helping you splash something expensive. Now, if you do already have decent mana for a splash and you're doing it anyway, it does have some additional upside. All that said, it's still a threaten effect, and they tend to have serious limitations. They're highly situational, is the main thing. This means, with this type of effect, you either want to be using it when you can kill your opponent with the help of their new creature that you get out of your way, or you can sacrifice the creature, and those things won't always line up. But still, I think a lot of red decks will run the first copy of this and feel fine about it. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Transmogrify, which for 3 generic and a red is a rare sorcery. It says exile target creature. That creature's controller reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a creature card. That player puts that card onto the battlefield, then shuffles the rest into their library. Well, red usually gets at least 1 rare or mythic that is a super random card that looks like fun, but isn't so good in limited, and that is what we have here. Most of the ways you could use this, you are really relying on chance. If you use it on your opponent, you have to hope they get a worse creature. Something that is a safe bet if they have a bomb in play, but something that is definitely not guaranteed against most creatures, and really paying 4 just to downgrade their best creature is not going to feel great. If you use it on yourself, you kind of have to hope that you hit something better. Now sure, you could use this on a creature token, but even if you're cashing in a token for a random creature, 4 mana isn't going to be worth it all that often. I think it's best to steer clear of this. I think it's an F. Next up, it's Turn to Slag, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a common sorcery. It deals 5 damage to target creature. Destroy all equipment attached to that creature. Say hello to red's obligatory, inefficient, clunky removal spell that gets the job done. 5 mana for 5 damage at sorcery speed is not great, and not going to be something you can use efficiently in most cases. That said, there are a couple of actual playable pieces of equipment at the lower rarities in this format, so you may find yourself managing to get a 2-for-1 out of this on occasion, and that will feel pretty sweet. Even if Turn to Slag is inefficient, it can kill most things, and while that doesn't make it premium, it should be valued above the average cards in this set, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Turret Ogre, who for 3 generic and a red is a 4/3 Ogre Warrior at common. It's got reach, and when it enters the battlefield, if you control another creature with power 4 or greater, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. While it may not be the most exciting of the 4 power payoffs in this set, it has a very reasonable baseline as a 4 mana 4/3 with reach, and sometimes this guy coming down and chipping in for those 2 damage can really help you finish off an opponent who has managed to stabilize. He's a solid playable for all red decks, and has some nice minor upside in the red-green deck, giving him a C. Next up, it's Unleash Fury, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon instant, and it says double the power of target creature until end of turn. I don't like this trick. Doubling power sounds really cool, and people will imagine the ideal scenario with this, where an opponent lets a 5/5 through and bam, you get in for 10 and in the game, and that will happen, but that kind of card is too situational for most limited decks. For this to really be worthwhile, it would also have to be good as a combat trick, and it won't be. It doesn't help your creature survive combat because it doesn't raise toughness at all, so you'll frequently just 2-for-1 yourself by using this in combat. I suppose if you have a bunch of First Strike, it could get more interesting, but this is why something like Sure Strike is far more appealing. It can chip in extra damage if it needs to, but it also wins combat most of the time, allowing you to trade for a creature. Unleash Fury does not. I think this will probably find its way into some hyper-aggressive decks as a sort of lava axe effect, but personally I don't ever plan on playing this, giving it a D-. Next, it's Volcanic Geyser, which for X generic mana and 2 red is an uncommon instant, and it deals X damage to any target. This is a reprint of a card that made its debut way back in Mirage, and one we've seen in a few other core sets. X spells like this have advantages and disadvantages. The main disadvantage is that usually you're not going to be getting a ton of tempo out of something like this, as it is a pretty inefficient removal spell wherever you cast it. If you pay 5 mana, you're only doing 3 damage, and that's not ideal. But there are some big upsides here too. It's flexible, capable of killing just about anything in the late game, and it can even go to your opponent's face to finish them off. This particular X burn spell also happens to be an instant, and that can make up for the inefficiency sometimes. For example, you can use it in response to an aura or combat trick, or after your opponent double blocks a creature, at which point you can fire this off to get a 2-for-1 out of the deal. Still, it's pretty weak in the early game, and its usefulness increases as the game goes on. I think all of that holds us just below being something I want to first pick, but it's pretty close. I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being more like a B-, but I'm going to start it at C+. Our last red card is Volcanic Salvo, which costs 10 generic and 2 red for a rare sorcery. It costs X less to cast, where X is the total power of creatures you control, and it deals 6 damage to each of up to 2 target creatures and or planeswalkers. So 12 is obviously a silly amount of mana, and in an absolute fail case where your board is empty, it's going to be pretty painful to have this in your hand. That said, your situation won't usually be that dire, and I don't think it is unreasonable to imagine paying 7 for this. 7 mana to do 6 to 2 creatures is a great deal, and a powerful 2-for-1. If it gets any cheaper than that, things start to get really silly, but I would guess the average is somewhere between 6 and 7. Still, this is the kind of card that can quickly get you back ahead from behind by killing 2 large creatures. This has a serious downside to be sure, but I don't think the worst case scenario will be all that commonplace. Nor do I think paying like 3 mana for it will happen a lot either. All of that makes this a card I want to take early though. I think it's a B. Well, that does it for all the red cards in Core Set 2021. If you disagree with any of my evaluations, let me know in the comments. Discussion about these cards can only help us all be better at Magic. Tomorrow I'll be back to look at all the green cards in this set. By the way, my videos are of course sponsored by Card Kingdom, and you can pre-order Core Set 2021 there now if you follow my referral link in the description, so go check that out. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you see the rest of the set review and a bunch more limited content, don't forget to subscribe. And if you need to see the other limited review videos, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.